Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something that affects, well, pretty much everyone, stress. Specifically, how our bodies actually react to it.
That's right. We're digging into some great sources you sent over, especially Robert Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and our mission here is to boil down all this complex science. We want to give you the key insights without making your head spin. You want the knowledge fast and clear.
Exactly. And the sources cover a lot of ground, From tiny cells right up to how society impacts our stress levels. We'll hit the highlights, ulcers, immunity, social stuff, all of it.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is stress, according to these sources? Think like a zebra, maybe?
Yeah, the zebra example is good. So a stressor is basically anything that knocks the body out of its happy balance, what scientists call homeostasis.
Like a lion showing up suddenly?
Precisely. And the stress response is just the body scrambling to get back to that steady state, restore the balance.
Simple enough for a zebra. But for us humans, it gets trickier, doesn't it?
Way trickier, because we don't just react to being knocked off balance. We react to the thought of it, the anticipation.
Ah, right. So that big presentation tomorrow, lying awake worrying about it.
That's a stressor for us, even though there's no lion in the room. Your body can fire up the same stress response.
So our ability to think ahead, to worry, that's the big difference. Zebras deal with short, sharp physical threats. We deal with chronic psychological stuff.
And that's why zebras generally don't get ulcers or the other chronic stress-related diseases we see in humans. They don't keep that stress response running constantly just by thinking.
Okay, let's unpack this generalized stress response.
Yeah.
The source mentioned Hans Salai and his slightly chaotic rat experiments.
Yeah, Salai stumbled onto something big. He was injecting these rats, stressing them out without really meaning to, and he noticed this pattern.
What was the pattern?
3 things kept showing up. Peptic ulcers, their adrenal glands got really big, and their immune tissues actually shrunk.
Wow. And the weird part was, it happened no matter what kind of stress they were under.
Exactly. Whether it was injections, cold, heat, whatever he did, same pattern. That was the puzzle. Why this one-size-fits-all response?
Because usually biology is specific, right? Heat makes you sweat, cold makes you shiver. Not the same response for everything.
Right. But the stress response is different. It's mainly run by the autonomic nervous system, and it's designed to prep the body for, well, pretty much any major challenge.
Okay, autonomic nervous system. 2 main parts, yeah.
Yep. You've got the sympathetic nervous system, that's your fight or flight, gets you revved up, gas pedal.
And the parasympathetic.
That's the rest and digest, calms things down, promotes storage and growth. The brake pedal, they work in opposition.
Got it. Accelerator and brake.
Yeah.
And how do hormones fit in? For a while, people thought glands just did their own thing.
Yeah, there was this idea that, the adrenal glands just decided when to release hormones, kind of independently. Led to some strange medical ideas back then.
But that wasn't right.
No. The big breakthrough came from researchers like Gilliman and Shalley. They discovered releasing hormones.
Showing the brain is actually in charge, the conductor of the orchestra.
Exactly. The brain tells the glands what to do, which brings us to the HPA axis.
Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Okay, break that down.
So your brain senses stress. The hypothalamus, a part of the brain, releases CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone.
Okay.
CRH travels a tiny distance to the pituitary gland right below it, tells the pituitary, release ACTH.
ACTH.
Adrenocorticotropic hormone. That goes into your bloodstream, travels down to the adrenal gland sitting on top of your kidneys.
It tells them.
Release glucocorticoids, like cortisol, the famous one. It's this chain reaction, starting in the brain.
So glucocorticoids plus those fight or flight hormones like adrenaline.
Yeah.
That's the core of the stress response.
That's the main hormonal punch, yeah. But the sources also mention a possible difference between sexes, the tend and befriend idea.
Right, Shelley Taylor's concept. The idea that females, maybe because of caring for offspring evolutionarily, might lean more towards nurturing and seeking social support under stress rather than just fight or flight.
And there's some evidence for that. Women often do report using social connections more when stressed. It's an interesting layer.
But important note. Even with this general response, it's not identical every single time, is it?
No, absolutely not. Different stressors can create slightly different hormonal signatures, The timing, the mix of sympathetic versus glucocorticoid activation, it can vary. It's nuanced.
Okay, so this system is designed for emergencies. But what happens when the emergency is our own thoughts?
Yeah.
Chronic psychological stress. That's where things go wrong, right?
That's the crux of the problem for us modern humans. Think about the zebra running from the lion. Its heart pounds, blood pressure shoots up, blood goes to its muscles. Perfect for running.
Makes sense. Body matches the need.
But what if you're stressed about a deadline? Your heart pounds, blood pressure goes up, blood rushes to your muscles. But you're just sitting there worrying.
So the body is prepping for a fight or flight that never happens.
Exactly. And doing that over and over, that puts serious wear and tear on your cardiovascular system.
How did that damage actually happen?
Well, first, the repeated high blood pressure physically damages the lining of your arteries, especially where they branch. It's like sandblasting the pipes.
Ouch.
That damage triggers inflammation. Immune cells rush in, things like cholesterol get deposited. You start getting buildup, plaque.
And the stress hormones themselves play a role too.
Oh, yeah. Epinephrine, or adrenaline, makes your blood platelets stickier, more likely to clump. Plus, stress dumps fats and glucose into your blood. More building blocks for those plaques. Atherosclerosis.
So it's not just about cholesterol levels then. You hear so much about cholesterol.
Cholesterol is a factor, definitely. But it's not the whole story. Plenty people have heart attacks with normal cholesterol. It's the overall inflammation and damage in the vessels fueled by chronic stress that's often the bigger issue.
The sources even mentioned a link to sudden cardiac death. That story about the elderly couple really brings it home.
It does. Intense emotional stress can, in rare cases, trigger fatal heart rhythms. It shows that incredibly powerful mind-body connection.
And what about women and heart disease? It's often seen as a man's disease, but that's not accurate, is it?
Not at all. It's the leading cause of death for women, too. And rates are actually increasing for women, which is worrying. Plus, women are more likely to be disabled after a heart attack.
Why the higher disability rate?
It seems related to age. Women tend to have heart attacks, on average, about 10 years later than men. So if a woman has a heart attack, she's likely older, and recovery can be harder.
The whole hormone replacement therapy thing seems really confusing, too. Does it help or hurt heart health?
It is confusing. Early studies hinted estrogen might protect the heart, but then a big study looking at estrogen plus progestin found it actually increased risk.
So it depends on the specific hormones.
Seems like it. The type, the dose, whether it's estrogen alone, it's complicated. We definitely need more research there.
Okay, and just to clear it up, voodoo death. Not about the parasympathetic system going wild.
Right. That term is problematic anyway, but the phenomenon itself is probably more like an extreme version of sudden cardiac death, likely caused by a massive sympathetic surge fight-or-flight overdrive, leading to dangerous heart rhythms, not the heart just slowing down too much.
Got it. Okay, let's shift gears. Energy. How does stress mess with how we use and store energy from food?
Okay, so normally you eat food. Proteins become amino acids, carbs become glucose, fats become fatty acids. Your body uses some and stores the rest, right? Insulin helps with the storage.
Makes sense, like putting money in the bank.
Exactly. But during acute stress, the body yells, forget the bank, empty the account, we need cash now.
So it stops storing energy.
Stops storing and starts dumping stored energy glucose and fatty acids into the bloodstream. Insulin levels drop. Everything's geared for immediate use.
Makes sense for running from that lion, but chronic stress.
That's where it backfires. You get chronically elevated glucose and fatty acids floating around. Not good.
And this leads to insulin resistance.
Yes. Glucocorticoids, those main stress hormones, actually make your fat cells less responsive to insulin. They don't take up glucose and fats as well.
And that affects other parts of the body too.
It does. Those resistant fat cells release signals that make muscles and the liver less sensitive to insulin as well. It's a snowball effect.
Which is why people on long-term steroid drugs, which are synthetic glucocorticoids, can actually develop diabetes.
Exactly. Steroid diabetes. And even without those drugs, chronic stress can push you towards insulin resistance. Your pancreas tries to compensate by pumping out more insulin.
Until it just gets exhausted.
Potentially, yeah. The insulin-producing cells can eventually burn out. It's a vicious cycle.
And combine that with, modern diets and less exercise.
And you see why obesity and type 2 diabetes rates are soaring? One researcher, Joseph Iyer, bluntly called it prosperity as a cause of death. Our lifestyles create these chronic stressors.
It kind of challenges the idea that our bodies always know best about weight, doesn't it? Why keep gaining weight under stress if you have enough fat?
That's where Peter Sterling's idea of allostasis comes in. He argued that regulation isn't just simple feedback. Psychological factors, social pressures that can override basic signals like we have enough energy stored, appetite, is complex.
And all these metabolic issues clustering together, that's metabolic syndrome.
Right. It's a collection. High insulin, high glucose, high blood pressure, insulin resistance, bad cholesterol profiles, and often extra belly fat. They all tend to run together. Having one increases your risk for the others. Stress is a major player.
Okay, what about stress and just wanting to eat or not wanting to eat? It seems contradictory.
It does, doesn't it? That initial loss of appetite during sudden stress makes sense. Who wants a sandwich when a lion's chasing you? Digestion is shut down.
Survival first.
Right. But then other things kick in. Beta endorphins, which are related to opioids, get released during stress and can actually stimulate appetite. And glucocorticoids, hanging around after the initial adrenaline rush, also encourage eating.
Why do glucocorticoids stimulate appetite?
The thinking is, after the emergency, the body wants to replenish the energy stores it just burned or got ready to burn. Glucocorticoids help drive that.
And because glucocorticoids stick around longer than the initial stress hormones.
You can end up feeling hungry after the stressful event is technically over. The timing matters.
Interesting. Okay, moving down the digestive tract. How else does stress affect things?
Well, it generally speeds things up lower down, increases contractions in the colon.
Why?
The theory is, in an emergency, you want to ditch any unnecessary weight. Literally. Lighten the load for fight or flight.
But that causes problems, right? Like IBS.
Exactly. That increased contractility is basically what happens in irritable bowel syndrome or spastic colon. Leads to cramping, diarrhea. Although, interestingly, if the stress is chronic and the contractions get really disorganized, it can sometimes lead to constipation instead.
Now, ulcers. For years, everyone blamed stress. But that changed, didn't it?
Massively. The big discovery was the bacterium Helicobacter pylori. Barry Marshall famously even drank the stuff to prove it caused gastritis, which leads to ulcers.
So this tough little bug can live in stomach acid and is the main cause.
Yep, for most peptic ulcers, it was a total revolution in understanding them.
So stress is off the hook completely for ulcers.
Not completely. While H. pylori is the main culprit, stress can still be a contributing factor. Remember how stress diverts blood flow away from the gut?
Right, sends it to the muscles.
Well, that temporary decrease in blood flow to the stomach lining can cause tiny bits of tissue damage. Makes the lining weaker, more vulnerable to damage from acid, or, importantly, from H. pylori if it's present. Stress doesn't cause the ulcer directly, but it can weaken the defenses.
Okay, makes sense. Let's shift to growth. How does stress affect something as fundamental as growing?
It seems almost mystical how food turns into...
Close.
Right. But stress, especially early in life, can really interfere with that process.
We hear about fetal programming or metabolic imprinting, like the studies from the Dutch hunger winter during World War II.
Exactly. Fetuses that experienced starvation adapted by developing a thrifty metabolism. Great for surviving famine, but it made them much more prone to hypertension, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, later in life when food was plentiful.
That's the FOAD concept, fetal origins of adult disease.
Right. And it's not just lack of food. Other kinds of stress on the mother during pregnancy, psychological stress, illness can have similar long-term programming effects on the baby's metabolism and stress hormone levels.
So a stressful pregnancy might lead to a child who has higher baseline stress hormone levels as an adult.
That's the idea, potentially contributing to things like metabolic syndrome down the line. It highlights how critical that prenatal environment is.
And Michael Meany's work with rats and maternal care, that was fascinating.
Just stunning work. He showed that how much a mother rat licks and grooms her pups in the first week of life permanently shapes their stress response. Pups with low-licking mothers had higher glucocorticoid levels for their entire lives.
Wow. Just from licking and grooming. It really shows the power of early experience.
Absolutely. And on the extreme end, you have stress dwarfism.
Where severe emotional neglect or abuse can literally stop a child from growing.
Yes. Psychosocial dwarfism. No underlying medical reason, just the severe stress shutting down growth hormone release. The old orphanage studies, like with Fraulein Schwartz and Grun, showed dramatic growth spurts when kids were moved to a more nurturing environment.
Just incredible. And a stark reminder of how basic nurturing is for physical development. What about bones? Does stress affect bone health?
It can, definitely. Chronic stress, high glucocorticoids, they're bad for bones. They inhibit bone formation and increase bone resorption. Increases the risk of osteoporosis.
Like JFK. He had severe osteoporosis.
likely exacerbated, if not partly caused, by the high doses of synthetic glucocorticoids he took for Addison's disease and other issues. And there are animal studies too, monkeys under social stress losing bone density.
So it all comes back to needing that sense of safety, maybe even love, for basic biology to work right, especially early on.
It really seems that way. Things we might think of as soft concepts have very real, hard biological consequences.
Okay, let's talk about stress and reproduction. How does stress interfere here? Starting with males.
Well, major physical stressors, surgery, serious illness, starvation, they shut down the reproductive system pretty quickly. Testosterone levels plummet.
Makes sense. Body prioritizes survival over making babies.
Exactly. But what's interesting is that even psychological stressors can do it. Things like losing social rank in monkey troops, or even just humans going through stressful training, like in that officer candidate school study. Testosterone dropped.
And erections seem particularly sensitive to stress.
Very much so. Erectile function relies heavily on the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest side. Stress activates the sympathetic fight-or-flight side, which actively inhibits erections. It often gets knocked out faster than testosterone production does.
Are there exceptions? Times when stress doesn't shut down male reproduction?
Sometimes, yeah, like bull moose during mating season. They're incredibly stressed, fighting constantly, but that stress is part of the reproductive drive. They need to compete to mate, so context matters.
And for women, how does chronic stress affect female reproduction?
It can suppress the whole system, disrupt menstrual cycles, lead to cycles where no egg is released, anovulatory cycles, reduces fertility.
The sources mentioned a difference between hunter-gatherer women and modern Western women in terms of cycles.
Yeah, hunter-gatherer women, often due to longer periods of breastfeeding, have far fewer menstrual cycles over their lifetime compared to women in industrialized societies. This raises questions about whether our higher number of cycles might be linked to higher rates of things like endometriosis, but it's complex.
Does stress affect female libido too?
It can, likely by suppressing sex hormones like estrogen. But in humans, maybe even more than in other animals, sexual desire is really strongly influenced by psychological factors, relationship dynamics, social context. It's not just hormones.
And the stress of infertility treatments, like IVF, that must be immense.
Huge. Emotionally, physically, financially, it's a major, major stressor for couples going through it.
The sources also mention stress causing miscarriages, especially in animals.
Yes, things like capture, transport, or even social upheaval, like a new dominant male taking over a troop and harassing pregnant females, can unfortunately trigger miscarriages in various species. The stress is just too much.
Okay, let's tackle the immune system. This connection is complex, right? Stress doesn't just automatically weaken it.
Not at all. That's a common misconception. Initially, right after a stressor hits in the first few minutes to maybe an hour, many aspects of immunity are actually enhanced.
Enhanced? Why?
Think about it evolutionarily. If you just got injured fighting that lion, you'd want your immune system primed to deal with potential infection or inflammation at the wound site, right?
Right.
Especially your innate immunity, the fast first responders.
Okay, that makes sense. So a quick boost first.
Exactly. Both glucocorticoids and the sympathetic nervous system help mobilize immune cells and get them ready for action initially.
But then comes the suppression phase, if the stress goes on too long.
Right. That's phase B. With prolonged chronic stress, you see suppression of many immune functions, things like lymphocyte production, antibody formation. That initial boost isn't sustainable.
The sources talked about two routes for how stress affects immunity, the psychoneuroimmune route and the lifestyle route.
Yeah, the psychoneuroimmune route is the direct pathway. Stress affects the brain signals the immune system via nerves and hormones, and immune function changes.
And the lifestyle route.
That's indirect. Stress makes you sleep poorly, eat badly, maybe smoke or drink more, exercise less, and those behaviors weaken your immune system. In real life, it's often hard to untangle the two.
Like with bereavement. Losing a loved one is stressful emotionally, but it also disrupts routines, sleep, eating.
Exactly. Both pathways are likely contributing to the increased risk of illness sometimes seen after bereavement. The Common Cold Unit studies also famously showed people under more psychological stress were more likely to actually develop colds when exposed to the virus.
What about stress and serious illnesses like AIDS?
Again, it's complex and likely involves both routes. Stress might impact immune function directly, making the virus progress faster. But stress can also lead to behaviors that aren't good for managing HIV, and of course, having HIV is itself a massive stressor. It's often bidirectional.
And the link between stress hormones and herpes reactivation was really specific.
It's super specific and fascinating. It turns out the DNA of herpes viruses actually has a little segment that's sensitive to glucocorticoids. When your stress hormone levels go up, it's like a switch gets flipped, telling the dormant virus, okay, time to wake up and replicate. Causes those cold sores or other outbreaks.
Wow, okay, the big one. Stress and cancer. What's the evidence say? Does stress cause cancer?
The general consensus right now is that there's no strong evidence that stress significantly increases the risk of getting most cancers in humans. There might be a few exceptions, but overall, the link isn't strong for initial onset.
What about cancer coming back? Relapse?
That's less clear. Some studies hint at a possible link between stress and relapse risk, but the evidence is still limited.
And the most controversial area. Can stress make existing tumors grow faster? Or can stress reduction slow them down?
That's where there's the most debate and conflicting findings. Some animal studies suggest stress can accelerate tumor growth, but human studies are much harder to interpret and have produced mixed results. It's an active area of research.
The sources were pretty critical of the idea that just having a will to live cures cancer, though.
Very critical, and rightly so. That simplistic view, sometimes pushed by people like Siegel, can be incredibly harmful. It implies that if your cancer progresses, it's somehow your fault for not being positive enough. That adds guilt to an already devastating situation.
Good point. Okay, briefly, sudden infant death syndrome, SIAS. The understanding has shifted, right?
Yes. The current thinking involves factors like accidental oxygen deprivation, like unsafe sleeping positions, combined with potential vulnerabilities in the infant's brainstem development. The historical context mentioned, with potential biases in old autopsy samples from poor infants, is a reminder of how social factors can even skew medical understanding.
Let's switch to pain. Stress can change how we feel pain, sometimes making it better, sometimes worse.
Exactly. Pain isn't just a simple signal. It's heavily modulated. Think about how rubbing a sore spot can make it feel better. That's the gate control theory in action. Other sensations can interfere with the pain signal going up to the brain.
And stress itself can reduce pain. Stress-induced analgesia.
Yes. In highly stressful situations, the body releases its own natural painkillers, endogenous opioids, like endorphins. That's why soldiers wounded in battle might not feel the pain immediately, or why athletes can push through injuries during intense competition. Exercise itself can trigger this.
And these endogenous opioids are involved in the placebo effect, too.
Believed to be a major part of it, yes. When you expect relief, your brain can actually release these opioids, producing real physiological changes. Though one study mentioned did question just how widespread and powerful placebo effects are across all conditions.
But stress can also make pain worse. Hyperalgesia.
Yes. Sometimes, particularly with psychological stress or anxiety, you can become more sensitive to pain. It might involve increased activity in the brain's pain circuits, or just worrying about a symptom can amplify the perception of it.
So it depends. Massive injury might lead to less pain perception, but worrying about a headache might make it feel worse.
That seems to be the general pattern, yeah. Analgesia for big physical traumas, hyperalgesia often linked to psychological distress, and anxiety about smaller things.
Okay, memory. Another area where stress has seemingly opposite effects. Sometimes it enhances memory.
Definitely. We tend to have very strong, vivid memories for emotionally charged events. Flashbulb memories, they're sometimes called. You remember exactly where you were when something major happened.
But other times, stress totally messes up memory retrieval, right? Like blanking during an exam.
Absolutely. Acute stress can make it really hard to access information you actually know. Finding the right words, remembering facts under pressure.
How does the memory enhancement part work? The Cahill and McGough study was key here.
Yeah, that was crucial. They showed that the enhanced memory for emotional events depends on the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. If you block that response with a drug like propranolol, you block the memory boost.
So the adrenaline rush helps sear the memory in.
Essentially, yes. It signals to the brain, this is important, remember this.
But chronic stress, that's bad for memory.
It tends to be. Chronic stress can cause the branches, the dendrites of neurons in the hippocampus, a key memory area, to actually shrink temporarily. Not necessarily killing the cells, but making connections weaker and memories harder to retrieve.
And potentially long-term damage with really prolonged stress and high glucocorticoids.
There's concern about that, yes. Studies link chronic stress and high cortisol to hippocampal shrinkage and memory problems in conditions like PTSD, Cushing's disease, and even potentially in normal aging, though causality is complex. The hippocampus is involved in turning off the stress response too, so damage there can create a nasty feedback loop.
Stress affects working memory too, right? That moment-to-moment mental juggling.
Yes, brain imaging shows that under stress, like sleep deprivation, the frontal cortex might work harder but less efficiently on working memory tasks. And remember that study on flight attendants.
With the different recovery times between flights.
Right. Those with shorter recovery, at times more chronic stress and jet lag, had higher cortisol, worse explicit memory scores, and even slightly smaller temporal lobe volumes. A worrying link.
Which leads us nicely into sleep. Stress and sleep are tightly linked, aren't they? Both affect memory consolidation.
Absolutely. Both slow-wave sleep and REM sleep are vital for cementing memories. Stress disrupts sleep architecture, interfering with those consolidation processes, and lack of sleep itself is a stressor.
A vicious cycle. Sleep deprivation raises stress hormones.
Yes, you get elevated sympathetic tone, higher glucocorticoid levels when you're sleep deprived. It impairs learning and memory partly because of those elevated stress hormones messing with brain function.
And just worrying about not sleeping can cause bad sleep.
Ah, yeah, the cruel irony. The expectation of poor sleep can generate enough anxiety to actually cause it.
But there's a normal rise in stress hormones before waking up.
Yes, that's natural. Cortisol levels typically rise in the last few hours of sleep, helping to gently wake you up and prepare you for the day's demands. That's a healthy rhythm.
Okay, let's talk aging. It's something we all face. Sometimes it feels like it's all downhill.
Well, the gerontology research actually paints a surprisingly positive picture in many ways. Fewer older adults end up institutionalized than people think. Relationship quality often improves. Some cognitive skills hold steady or even get better. And happiness levels tend to increase with age, believe it or not.
Really, increased happiness.
Yeah, there's a documented positivity effect where older adults tend to focus more on and remember positive information compared to negative. Their brains seem to shift focus.
But the stress response does change with age. Sometimes not for the better.
Right. Sometimes the issue is an insufficient response when needed, but more often the problem is an overactive or prolonged response. Stress hormones like epinephrine and cortisol might take longer to return to baseline after a stressor, and baseline levels might creep up.
And that links back to the idea of glucocorticoid neurotoxicity. Too much cortisol exposure over time may be accelerating brain aging.
That's the theory. It's hard to prove definitively in humans, but the association is there. Think of the salmon they spawn, have a massive glucocorticoid surge, and then die rapidly. A dramatic, albeit extreme example of stress hormones potentially accelerating the end.
But it's not inevitable. Successful aging is possible.
Absolutely. Lifestyle, genetics, stress management, they all play a role. Those negative cascades don't have to happen.
So how do we influence this? How can our psychology actually change the physiological stress response?
Yeah.
The supportive nurse example was powerful.
It really was. Just having that social support, that human connection, dramatically lowered the stress hormone levels in those kids undergoing a painful procedure compared to being alone. Psychology directly impacted physiology.
Predictability helps too, right? Knowing what's coming.
Generally, yes. Like the dentist telling you, okay, now you'll feel a little pressure. It gives you a sense of, well, not control exactly, but you're not completely in the dark. It reduces the uncertainty.
But feeling like things are getting worse makes stress worse.
Definitely. The perception of losing ground, things deteriorating, that amplifies the stress response.
And the feeling of control itself is huge.
Absolutely critical. Remember the rats. Voluntary wheel running is stress reducing. Being forced to run on a wheel is highly stressful. Same activity, different perception of control. That's why lack of control is such a big factor in workplace stress.
The meaning we give an event matters too. Pain meaning a drug is working versus just pain.
Exactly. It's not just the objective event, but our interpretation of it. Although predictability isn't always good. Vague warnings or knowing something truly awful is unavoidable might not help or could even make things worse.
And control has nuances too. An illusion of control can backfire.
It can. If you think you have control over something truly awful and uncontrollable, and then it happens anyway, you might end up blaming yourself. And sometimes, for people with a very strong internal sense of control, facing genuinely uncontrollable situations, like some aspects of aging, can be more stressful.
So wrapping up this section. Outlets for frustration, social support, feeling like things might improve, having a sense of control and predictability. These are the key psychological buffers.
Those are the big ones, yeah. They fundamentally change how our bodies experience and respond to external challenges.
Okay, let's connect stress to mental health, depression, and anxiety. Our psychological filters really shape things here, don't they?
Hugely. How we interpret events is central. In depression, there's often a negative cognitive bias, seeing the world through dark-tinted glasses. Everything gets interpreted negatively.
And major depression isn't just feeling sad. It's a real illness with physical symptoms.
Absolutely. Those vegetative symptoms, changes in sleep, appetite, energy levels, are key diagnostic features. Often the opposite of just feeling blue, like loss of appetite or early morning waking.
The neurotransmitter theory, serotonin, norepinephrine, it's complicated, isn't it? Drugs affect them quickly, but relief takes weeks.
Right, which has led to theories about downstream effects, like changes in receptor sensitivity rather than just the raw levels of neurotransmitters being the whole story. Other hormones, like thyroid hormone, are involved too.
And stressful life events definitely increase the risk of depression.
Clear link there. Stress seems to be a major trigger, especially for first episodes. And animal studies show chronic stress can induce anhedonia, loss of pleasure, which is a core symptom of human depression.
What about glucocorticoids, stress hormones themselves?
There's a strong connection. People with Cushing's syndrome who have way too much cortisol often develop severe depression. People taking high-dose synthetic glucocorticoids often report mood changes, sometimes euphoria first, then depression. Causality is tricky, but the link is there. Anti-glucocorticoids are even being explored as potential antidepressants.
And maybe inhibited neuron growth in the hippocampus plays a role too.
That's a more controversial idea, but some researchers propose that reduced neurogenesis might contribute to both the cognitive and emotional symptoms of depression.
Freud talked about loss and ambivalence leading to melancholia, and the learned helplessness model.
Right, based on animal studies where inescapable stress leads to a state of passivity and giving up, which looks a lot like some aspects of human depression.
Genetics matter too. That serotonin transporter gene.
Yes, the 5-HTT gene. Different versions affect how efficiently serotonin is cleared from synapses, and research suggests that having certain versions makes individuals more susceptible to developing depression after stressful life events, possibly interacting with glucocorticoid levels.
Personality styles seem relevant too. Hostile competitive types versus more positive ones.
Seems so. Studies link hostility and competitiveness, aspects of the old type A idea, with more negative physiological stress responses. And Suomi's work with those high reactor monkeys showed lifelong differences in temperament and stress reactivity.
Depressives might not even try to cope, while anxious people are hyper alert.
That's a key difference often seen. Anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety, phobias, panic, OCD, PTSD, are characterized by excessive fear and vigilance. The amygdala, the brain's fear center, seems much more involved in anxiety than the hippocampus. It's highly connected to sensory input, the autonomic system, and it's also sensitive to glucocorticoids.
Revisiting type A personality hostility seems to be the really toxic ingredient for heart health.
That's what later research zeroed in on, yeah. Not just being busy or ambitious, but that cynical hostility. Though Friedman himself later emphasized time pressure and insecurity. That upholsterer noticing the worn-out chairs in the waiting room, classic story of accidental discovery.
And Friedman's later reflections are interesting too. Then there are repressive personalities.
Right. People who seem calm on the surface deny feeling stressed, but physiologically their bodies are going haywire, high cortisol, high sympathetic activity.
Yeah.
And they tend to have worse health outcomes. What you see isn't always what you get internally.
Why do we sometimes seek stress? Roller coasters, scary movies?
Good question. Schultz's work on dopamine is relevant here. The brain's reward system responds strongly to unpredictability and intermittent reinforcement. A little bit of controlled stress, where you know you're ultimately safe, can be exciting, pleasurable even. It's about the context and control.
Let's touch on addiction. How does stress play into that?
Stress seems to make the brain more vulnerable. Chronic stress, elevated glucocorticoids, they can mess with the dopamine reward pathway, either sensitizing it or making it harder to feel pleasure from normal things, potentially driving drug seeking.
And stress makes withdrawal worse.
Yes, by further disrupting dopamine function, it can intensify cravings and make withdrawal symptoms much harder to endure.
And relapse. Stress is a major trigger.
Huge trigger. Both animal studies and human experience show that stressful events significantly increase the likelihood of relapse in people recovering from addiction.
Okay. Broadening out social factors, socioeconomic status, SES, these matter hugely for stress.
Yeah. Immensely. Studying social rank in humans is tricky because it's so subjective, unlike in monkey troops. But poverty is a profound chronic stressor. Not just the lack of money, but the lack of control, resources, and constant need to deal with crises.
And it's not just objective poverty, but feeling poor. Adler's work.
Right, subjective SES. Feeling lower down the ladder, even if you're not objectively destitute, seems to have negative health consequences. It's about the comparison and the feeling of disadvantage.
Wilkinson's idea connects societal inequality to health.
Yeah, he argues that societies with bigger income gaps tend to have worse average health outcomes, even for people who aren't poor. Possibly because inequality erodes social capital, trust, community involvement, social cohesion. Less trust means a more stressful society for everyone.
So after all this, how do we cope? How do we manage stress effectively?
Well, remember Meany's rats. Early life nurturing had lifelong benefits for their stress response. That points to building resilience early on.
And personality matters. Optimism, sense of control.
Those definitely help buffer against things like learned helplessness. Looking at baboons, Sapolsky identified useful strategies. Good social skills, building alliances, knowing which fights to pick, having control, finding outlets, focusing on the positive, strong social bonds.
Can we get used to stressors? Like the parachutists?
Yes, habituation is possible, especially for the psychological component. With repeated exposure to the same stressor, the anxiety and hormone spike often lessen over time, even if the physical demands remain.
Restoring control and predictability seems key in management too, like in hospitals or nursing homes.
Crucial. Giving patients more control over pain medication or nursing home residents' choices about their routines or room changes these things, significantly reduce stress and improve well-being.
But generic advice isn't always helpful. Context matters.
Absolutely. Telling a war refugee to try mindfulness might be less helpful than addressing their immediate safety needs. Coping strategies need to fit the situation.
Okay, what are some concrete techniques the sources mention?
Exercise is a big one. Regular, moderate, something you enjoy, not overdoing it.
Meditation.
Regular practice shows benefits during meditation, like lowered heart rate. Long-term effects on baseline physiology are a bit less clear-cut, but promising for psychological well-being.
Social support.
Very strong evidence for its benefits. Knowing you have people you can rely on is a powerful buffer, though the quality matters. Stressful relationships obviously don't help.
Religion or spirituality.
Often correlated with better health. Could be the social support, the structure, the sense of meaning or predictability it provides, though it can also be a source of stress, like guilt, for some.
What about changing how you think about stress? Cognitive reappraisal.
That's a really powerful tool. Consciously reframing a situation, looking for the positive, focusing on what you can control. Different styles work better for different problems. Problem solving for a fixable issue. Emotion-focused coping for dealing with loss.
It's not just about less stress, but maybe managing the energy. Energized calm.
I like that framing. Not just being passive, but finding equanimity even amidst challenges. The Serenity Prayer captures that beautifully. Accept what you can't change, change what you can, have the wisdom to know the difference. Flexibility is key.
And avoid things like John Henryism, trying to muscle through everything.
Right, that belief that sheer effort conquers all can lead straight to burnout and ill health when facing genuinely overwhelming or uncontrollable stressors. It's maladaptive.
So wrapping this all up, it's clear stress is incredibly complex, hitting us physically and mentally in so many ways.
But understanding these pathways, I think, is empowering. It helps demystify why we feel the way we do under pressure.
And it underlines how individual it all is. Our perceptions, our coping styles, they really matter.
Definitely. What stresses one person out might energize another. And what works as a coping mechanism is also very personal.
The aim isn't zero stress, right? That's impossible. It's about finding healthier ways to navigate it, building that resilience.
Exactly. Learning to manage the inevitable ups and downs without letting them overwhelm our systems long term.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over. Given everything we've talked about, the cardiovascular effects, the metabolic changes, the impact on memory and mood, what's maybe one small concrete thing you could tweak in your daily life to navigate stress a little bit better?
Something to think about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the science of stress. We hope it's given you some valuable insights to take away.